The first helicopter touched down in a clearing barely large enough to hold it. Rotor blades tore at the tall elephant grass, flattening it in violent circles. Dust and broken leaves exploded into the air. Inside the aircraft, American soldiers gripped their rifles and waited for the signal. They believed they were inserting into an empty landing zone. Intelligence had suggested scattered enemy forces in the area, nothing more than small patrols moving through the jungle. But the moment the first boots hit the ground, something felt wrong. The jungle was too quiet. No birds. No insects. Only the distant echo of movement somewhere beyond the tree line. Within minutes, that silence shattered. Gunfire erupted from the surrounding forest. Bullets ripped through the grass from 3 directions at once. Men dropped before they could even form a defensive line. The soldiers of the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division had just landed in the middle of something they did not yet understand. An entire North Vietnamese regiment was already waiting for them. And what followed in the Ia Drang Valley would become one of the most brutal and revealing battles of the entire Vietnam War. But the real question was far more unsettling. How did both armies walk into the same battlefield, without realizing the other was already there? The place was called the Ia Drang Valley. In November 1965, it was little more than a remote stretch of jungle in the central highlands of South Vietnam, near the border with Cambodia. To an untrained eye, the valley looked like an endless sea of green. Thick forest rolled across the land in waves of tangled vegetation, broken only by patches of tall elephant grass and scattered clearings where helicopters could land. But geography in war is never just scenery. The Ia Drang Valley sat at the base of the Chu Pong Massif, a massive mountain formation rising sharply along the Cambodian frontier. From its slopes, narrow jungle trails stretched eastward into South Vietnam, threading through valleys and ridgelines that had become silent corridors of war. For the North Vietnamese Army, these routes were lifelines. Men, weapons, ammunition, and supplies flowed through them from the sanctuary of Cambodia into the heart of South Vietnam. Entire regiments moved through the jungle undetected, disappearing into the terrain as if swallowed by the earth itself. And that was precisely the problem. By late 1965, the United States had dramatically escalated its involvement. In the Vietnam War, thousands of American combat troops were arriving every month, part of a strategy designed to stop the communist advance and stabilize the fragile South Vietnamese government. Yet the enemy they faced refused to fight the war in ways American commanders expected. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces rarely stood and fought large conventional battles. Instead, they struck quickly, ambushed patrols, sabotaged infrastructure, and then vanished into terrain that seemed built for guerrilla warfare. Dense jungle limited visibility to only a few meters. Thick vegetation swallowed sound and distorted distance. A unit could be within 100 meters of the enemy and never see them. And this was where the Americans believed technology would change the equation. The U.S. Army had recently introduced a revolutionary concept, the airmobile division. The 1st Cavalry Division had been reorganized around helicopters. Instead of moving soldiers slowly through jungle trails, commanders could now lift entire companies through the air and drop them directly into combat zones. Helicopters transformed mobility. Troops could bypass rivers, mountains, and dense jungle. Reinforcements could arrive within minutes. Wounded soldiers could be evacuated rapidly. Artillery support could be coordinated almost instantly. For American planners, this technology promised to solve one of the greatest problems of jungle warfare, finding the enemy. The idea was simple. Locate enemy forces using reconnaissance patrols or intelligence reports, then insert troops directly on top of them using helicopters. Surround them. Fix them in place. Destroy them with overwhelming firepower supported by artillery and airstrikes. On paper, it looked unstoppable. And this is where the Ia Drang Valley entered the story. American intelligence had begun detecting large North Vietnamese formations moving through the region near the Cambodian border. Reports suggested that elements of the North Vietnamese 33rd and 66th Regiments were operating in the area. This was unusual. Up to that point, much of the war had been dominated by guerrilla engagements. But these reports suggested something different: organized, regiment-sized North Vietnamese units moving deep into South Vietnam. For the first time, American commanders saw an opportunity. If they could locate and engage these units in a major battle, they could test their new airmobile doctrine against a conventional enemy formation. The Ia Drang Valley became the perfect laboratory. And so the 1st Cavalry Division began planning a series of aggressive search-and-destroy missions designed to draw the North Vietnamese into open battle. At the center of these plans was a young battalion commander named Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore. Moore commanded the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, a unit with a name deeply etched into American military history. Nearly 90 years earlier, the original 7th Cavalry had ridden across the plains of Montana under General George Armstrong Custer. Now the regiment had traded horses for helicopters. But the mission remained the same: ride into unknown territory and find the enemy. Moore understood the risks better than most. His battalion consisted of roughly 450 soldiers. In helicopter operations, those men would not arrive all at once. The transport helicopters could only carry part of the battalion at a time. This meant the first wave of soldiers could find themselves alone for crucial minutes before reinforcements arrived. In jungle combat, minutes could determine whether a unit survived. But the mission moved forward anyway. American reconnaissance aircraft had identified a potential landing zone near the base of the Chu Pong mountain range. It was a small clearing surrounded by dense jungle and tall grass. The maps labeled it Landing Zone X-ray. From above, it looked like a convenient insertion point. From the ground, it would soon become something very different. The morning of November 14, 1965, began with the rhythmic thump of helicopter blades echoing across the valley. Transport helicopters lined up in formation, carrying the first companies of Moore's battalion toward Landing Zone X-ray. Below them stretched miles of dense jungle. What the Americans did not yet know was that thousands of North Vietnamese soldiers were already moving through that same jungle, preparing for an entirely different kind of battle. Because while the Americans believed they were searching for the enemy had already chosen the battlefield. And what happened next would become one of the most violent clashes of the entire Vietnam War. By late 1965, American commanders believed they were beginning to understand the war in Vietnam. The strategy was called search and destroy. Instead of defending towns or guarding territory, American units would aggressively move through suspected enemy areas, locate communist forces, and eliminate them using superior firepower. Helicopters would insert troops deep into remote regions. Once the enemy was located, artillery, gunships, and tactical airstrikes would crush them. It was a strategy built on confidence. The United States possessed overwhelming advantages. Better weapons. Better communications. Vast artillery support. Jet aircraft capable of delivering devastating strikes within minutes. If the enemy chose to fight a conventional battle, American commanders believed the outcome would be inevitable. But there was a flaw in that assumption. And the Ia Drang Valley was about to expose it. The North Vietnamese Army had been studying American tactics carefully. For years, their commanders had fought the French during the First Indochina War. They had learned how Western armies relied on technology, logistics, and overwhelming firepower. They understood how these advantages could dominate large, open battlefields. So they designed a different kind of battlefield. Instead of avoiding American forces entirely, they would sometimes allow contact, but only under conditions that neutralized American strengths. Dense jungle. Close-range combat. Rapid movement through terrain only they fully understood. Under those conditions, artillery became harder to coordinate. Airstrikes became dangerous to friendly troops. Helicopter landing zones became vulnerable traps. And most importantly, close combat limited the ability of American forces to bring their technological advantage to bear. This concept was simple but deadly effective. Fight close enough to the enemy that his firepower becomes a liability. North Vietnamese commanders called this tactic, grabbing the enemy by the belt. If they stayed close to American units, sometimes only meters away, the Americans could not safely call artillery or airstrikes without risking their own men. It was a brutal form of warfare. And it required extraordinary discipline from soldiers. North Vietnamese units trained extensively for it. They practiced moving silently through jungle terrain. They rehearsed coordinated attacks from multiple directions. They learned to disappear into the vegetation after striking. But perhaps the most important advantage they possessed was patience. While American forces moved rapidly across the landscape using helicopters, North Vietnamese units often spent days or weeks maneuvering through jungle trails on foot. They could remain hidden in the terrain, watching and waiting. In the Ia Drang region, several North Vietnamese regiments had already begun concentrating near the Chu Pong Mountains. These were not small guerrilla groups. They were full combat formations, thousands of soldiers strong. Their mission was to attack South Vietnamese positions in the Central Highlands and cut key supply routes. The area near the Cambodian border offered a perfect staging ground. From there, they could move into South Vietnam, strike, and then retreat back across the border if necessary. But in November 1965, something unexpected happened. American forces moved into the same region. When U.S. reconnaissance began detecting signs of North Vietnamese activity, the 1st Cavalry Division was ordered to investigate aggressively. Helicopters began inserting American troops deeper and deeper into the valley. For the North Vietnamese commanders, this presented both a danger and an opportunity. They could withdraw across the border. Or they could do something far more ambitious. They could destroy an American battalion. If they could surround and annihilate a helicopter-inserted force before reinforcements arrived, the psychological impact would be enormous. It would demonstrate that the United States, despite its technology, could still be defeated on the battlefield. So they began preparing for exactly that scenario. Units moved into concealed positions throughout the jungle near the base of the Chu Pong Massif. Supply routes were established. Defensive positions were prepared. Patrols quietly monitored helicopter activity in the valley. They were watching the skies. Waiting. And then, on the morning of November 14, the helicopters came. Wave after wave of UH-1 Huey transport helicopters approached a small clearing known as Landing Zone X-ray. Inside those aircraft were the soldiers of Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore's battalion. Moore's men believed they were conducting a search operation. They expected to find enemy patrols. Perhaps even a small unit. But they had no idea that multiple North Vietnamese battalions were already moving through the jungle surrounding the landing zone. The first helicopters landed at approximately 10:48 in the morning. Within minutes, American soldiers began spreading out across the clearing, establishing a perimeter and preparing for the arrival of the rest of the battalion. For a brief moment, everything seemed to go according to plan. Then the shooting started. And within the next few hours, the battle in the Ia Drang Valley would escalate into one of the most intense close-range fights of the entire Vietnam War. But the real danger had only just begun to unfold. By the afternoon of November 14, 1965, something strange began appearing in the first radio reports from Landing Zone X-ray. The numbers didn't make sense. American soldiers were reporting enemy contact in every direction. Small patrols were bumping into North Vietnamese troops almost immediately after leaving the clearing. Firefights were erupting along the tree lines. Movement was detected constantly in the tall grass. Yet intelligence estimates had suggested only scattered enemy elements in the area. Not entire formations. At battalion headquarters, officers listening to the transmissions began noticing a disturbing pattern. The enemy wasn't retreating. They were advancing. Groups of North Vietnamese soldiers appeared from the jungle, engaged briefly, then disappeared. Minutes later, another group would appear from a different direction. Sometimes they were only a handful of men. Sometimes dozens. It felt less like a single unit and more like pieces of something much larger moving through the forest. And this is where the situation began to feel deeply unsettling. Because no one could see the full battlefield. The jungle swallowed everything. From the air, helicopter crews could see the small clearing of landing zone X-ray. But beyond that patch of open ground, the canopy closed like a green roof. Entire companies could move beneath it completely invisible to aircraft overhead. From the ground, the situation was even worse. Visibility inside the jungle was often less than 20 meters. Soldiers could hear movement, branches snapping, whispers carried through the vegetation, but identifying where the enemy actually was became almost impossible. And this uncertainty created a growing mystery. How many North Vietnamese soldiers were actually out there? Early contact reports suggested platoon-sized elements. Then company-sized groups. Some patrols reported encountering organized formations moving with remarkable coordination. But there was still no clear picture. What troubled Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore most was the discipline of the enemy. These were not irregular guerrilla fighters firing wildly from ambush positions. The North Vietnamese troops maneuvered deliberately. They advanced under cover. They used bugle calls and whistle signals to coordinate movement. This was a trained army. And they were moving toward the landing zone. But the most disturbing reports came from the forward patrols. One American platoon, moving toward a wooded area near the base of the Chu Pong Mountain, suddenly made contact with a much larger enemy force. The firefight escalated rapidly, and within minutes the platoon became separated from the rest of the company. The jungle had swallowed them. Radio transmissions from the isolated platoon came in bursts, heavy contact, enemy advancing, casualties mounting. Then the signal broke apart in static. No one knew exactly where they were. No one knew how many North Vietnamese soldiers surrounded them. And this is where the battle began to reveal something extraordinary. The Americans had believed they were conducting a search operation. But the pattern of enemy movement suggested something very different. The North Vietnamese were not stumbling into the Americans by accident. They were already here. Units were appearing from multiple directions with remarkable timing. They attacked quickly, then melted back into the jungle before artillery strikes could land. They closed the distance aggressively, forcing American soldiers into close-range firefights where air power could not easily be used. It was as if the battlefield itself had been prepared. Somewhere in the dense jungle surrounding landing zone X-ray, a much larger force was maneuvering, unseen, organized, and waiting for the right moment to strike. And for the soldiers fighting in that clearing, a terrible realization was beginning to form. They were not hunting the enemy. They had landed directly inside the enemy's battlefield. But the true scale of what was happening in the Ia Drang Valley would only become clear as the battle intensified. Because hidden in the jungle surrounding landing zone X-ray were not just scattered units, but entire North Vietnamese battalions moving silently through the trees. The American plan for battles like Ia Drang was built around a new idea of warfare. Mobility. For decades, infantry armies had moved across battlefields at the speed of a marching soldier. Terrain determined everything. Mountains slowed armies. Rivers blocked them. Jungle turned movement into a slow and exhausting crawl. Helicopters promised to break that limitation forever. The U.S. Army's airmobile doctrine was designed to transform how battles were fought. Instead of pushing troops slowly through hostile terrain, helicopters could lift soldiers directly into the heart of the battlefield. A company could be inserted into a remote clearing within minutes. Reinforcements could arrive just as quickly. Wounded soldiers could be evacuated before injuries became fatal. It was mobility on a scale no army had ever possessed before. The 1st Cavalry Division had been built entirely around this concept. Hundreds of helicopters formed the backbone of the division. Transport helicopters carried infantry. Gunships provided aerial fire support. Reconnaissance aircraft scouted ahead of advancing forces. When American commanders looked at a map of Vietnam, the jungle no longer seemed like an obstacle. It became a network of potential landing zones. Small clearings like Landing Zone X-ray were the key to the entire system. Once troops secured a landing zone, helicopters could shuttle in additional forces, artillery units, ammunition, and supplies. From that small patch of open ground, American units could expand outward and sweep the surrounding terrain. If enemy forces were located, artillery and aircraft could deliver devastating firepower within minutes. It was a doctrine built on speed, coordination, and overwhelming firepower. But there was a problem. The doctrine assumed that the enemy would fight from a distance. The North Vietnamese Army had studied this system carefully. And they designed a way to break it. Instead of engaging American forces at long range, North Vietnamese commanders trained their soldiers to close the distance as quickly as possible. When contact occurred, they pushed forward aggressively, attempting to fight within extremely short distances. Sometimes less than 50 meters. At that range, American advantages began to disappear. Artillery fire could no longer safely land near friendly troops. Airstrikes risked hitting American soldiers. Helicopter gunships found it difficult to distinguish friend from foe when both sides were tangled together in the same patch of jungle. The North Vietnamese called this tactic, hugging the enemy. Stay close enough to the American soldiers that their firepower cannot be used. It required extraordinary courage. North Vietnamese infantry units trained to move rapidly through jungle terrain, often attacking in waves from multiple directions. Their officers emphasized discipline and coordination. When they struck, they did so with speed. Rifle fire. Machine guns. Grenades. Close combat. The terrain helped them. The jungle around the Ia Drang Valley created a battlefield measured in meters rather than kilometers. Thick vegetation blocked sight lines and muffled sound. Units could maneuver unseen, appearing suddenly at the edge of a clearing or emerging from tall grass only moments before opening fire. For North Vietnamese commanders, this environment offered the perfect conditions. American helicopters could deliver troops anywhere. But those troops could also land in the middle of enemy formations they could not see. This is exactly what began to happen at Landing Zone X-ray. The first companies of Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore's battalion had landed successfully. Helicopters continued shuttling back and forth, bringing additional soldiers into the clearing. But each flight required time. And during those critical early minutes, Moore's men were only partially assembled. Small patrols moved cautiously beyond the clearing to establish defensive positions. And almost immediately, they began making contact with North Vietnamese troops. At first it seemed like scattered resistance. Then the pattern changed. Enemy soldiers began appearing in greater numbers. Fire erupted along multiple sectors of the perimeter. American patrols encountered organized formations moving through the jungle. And the distance between the two forces was shrinking rapidly. The North Vietnamese were closing in. Every minute that passed allowed more American troops to arrive by helicopter. But it also allowed more North Vietnamese soldiers to move toward the battlefield from the surrounding jungle. Two different systems of warfare were now colliding in the same clearing. One built on mobility and firepower. The other built on stealth, patience, and brutal close combat. And in the tangled vegetation of the Ia Drang Valley, both armies were about to discover just how deadly that collision could become. The helicopters kept coming. Every few minutes the deep thump of rotor blades echoed across the Ia Drang Valley as another formation of UH-1 Hueys swept over the treetops and dropped toward landing zone X-ray. Dust, grass, and shattered branches swirled violently each time they touched down. Soldiers jumped from the skids and ran into position while the aircraft lifted away almost immediately to return for another load. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore stood near the center of the clearing, radio pressed to his ear, watching the perimeter expand meter by meter. His battalion was arriving piece by piece. But the enemy was already there. The first serious contact had erupted only minutes after the initial landing. A platoon from Bravo Company had pushed out toward a cluster of trees near the base of the Chu Pong mountain range. They were searching for the North Vietnamese soldier who had fired the first shots at the landing zone. Instead, they found an entire enemy force. Gunfire exploded through the jungle. Within seconds the quiet patrol had turned into a desperate fight. Automatic weapons cracked from concealed positions. Grenades burst through the undergrowth. The American platoon, moving too far ahead of the main force, suddenly realized they were facing far more soldiers than expected. Moore received the report over the radio. Enemy troops were everywhere. And this is where the situation began to unravel. The platoon commander pushed forward aggressively, attempting to pursue retreating North Vietnamese soldiers into thicker vegetation. In the confusion of the firefight, the platoon moved deeper into the jungle. Too deep. Within minutes the terrain swallowed them completely. The rest of the company could no longer see them. The sounds of battle drifted through the trees, sometimes close, sometimes distant, distorted by the dense vegetation. The platoon had become separated. Radio calls began arriving at Moore's command post. Heavy contact. Enemy forces advancing. Casualties mounting. The isolated platoon was surrounded. But that wasn't the real problem. What happened next surprised everyone. Instead of withdrawing after the initial firefight, the North Vietnamese began pressing the attack. More soldiers moved through the jungle toward landing zone X-ray, advancing from multiple directions with remarkable coordination. American soldiers along the perimeter began reporting movement in the tall grass surrounding the clearing. Dark figures appeared briefly between the trees. Then disappeared. Then reappeared somewhere else. Machine gun fire erupted suddenly along the eastern side of the landing zone. Moments later another burst of automatic fire opened from the south. The jungle seemed alive with enemy movement. Moore quickly realized what was happening. The North Vietnamese were attempting to surround the landing zone before the entire battalion could assemble. He ordered his companies to tighten the defensive perimeter. Machine gun teams established firing positions along the edges of the clearing. Mortar crews prepared to deliver fire support wherever enemy concentrations appeared. But the battlefield was expanding faster than anyone expected. The isolated platoon, now cut off deep in the jungle, was fighting for survival. Its commander continued transmitting short bursts over the radio, describing waves of North Vietnamese soldiers moving through the vegetation around them. Ammunition was running low. Several men were already wounded. Attempts to reach them failed. American squads pushing forward to relieve the platoon encountered heavy fire and were forced back toward the landing zone. The jungle between them had become a killing ground. And this is where the scale of the battle began to reveal itself. Reports from multiple sectors of the perimeter confirmed the same pattern. North Vietnamese soldiers were appearing in organized groups, sometimes dozens at a time, advancing rapidly toward the clearing. Bugle calls echoed faintly through the jungle. Whistles answered them from different directions. Entire companies were moving through the forest. The Americans had landed directly beside a concentration of North Vietnamese regiments operating near the Chu Pong Mountains. What Moore had believed to be scattered enemy patrols were actually the forward elements of a much larger force. And they were closing in. By early afternoon, the firefight around Landing Zone X-ray had intensified into full-scale battle. North Vietnamese troops attacked repeatedly from the tree line, attempting to break through the American perimeter. Each assault was met with concentrated rifle fire, machine guns, and mortar shells. Helicopter gunships roared overhead, firing rockets into the surrounding jungle. Artillery units miles away began delivering devastating barrages onto enemy positions identified by forward observers. But the North Vietnamese kept advancing. They moved through the vegetation with relentless determination, sometimes closing to within a few meters of American positions before being driven back. At one point, enemy soldiers emerged suddenly from the tall elephant grass on the western edge of the clearing, firing automatic weapons as they charged forward. American machine gunners cut them down only meters from the defensive line. The battle raged across the entire perimeter. And still the helicopters continued arriving. Each new wave brought more American soldiers into the fight, reinforcing weak points in the defensive line and expanding the perimeter slightly outward. But every landing also drew more enemy attention. North Vietnamese units moved closer, tightening the circle around the clearing. Meanwhile, deep in the jungle beyond the perimeter, the isolated American platoon continued fighting alone. Their radio transmissions grew shorter, more frantic. Enemy soldiers were closing in from all directions. And as darkness slowly began creeping toward the valley, it became increasingly clear that the battle at Ia Drang was far from over. To understand why the battle at Ia Drang did not collapse into immediate disaster, you have to examine the decisions made inside that small clearing during the most chaotic hours of the fight. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore faced a situation that few commanders ever encounter. His battalion had been inserted into an unknown battlefield. Enemy forces were moving in from multiple directions. One of his platoons had already been cut off in the jungle. And the full strength of the North Vietnamese formation surrounding the valley was still unclear. But Moore did something critical. He imposed order. Instead of reacting to every burst of gunfire across the perimeter, he organized the defense around a simple principle: control the landing zone at all costs. The clearing itself became the center of gravity. If Landing Zone X-ray fell, helicopters could no longer bring reinforcements or evacuate the wounded. Without that lifeline, the battalion would eventually be overrun. So Moore positioned his companies in a tight defensive ring around the landing zone. Machine gun teams anchored key sectors of the perimeter, particularly along the areas where the jungle came closest to the clearing. The terrain shaped everything. On three sides of the landing zone, dense jungle pressed up against the edges of the clearing. The vegetation offered perfect cover for advancing North Vietnamese soldiers. But it also created narrow approaches where attackers would have to emerge briefly into open ground. Those few seconds in the open became decisive. American machine gunners concentrated their fire on these exposed points. When North Vietnamese units rushed forward from the trees, they were forced to cross small gaps in the vegetation where they could be seen. That was when the guns opened up. But positioning alone was not enough. What made the defense work was timing. Artillery units located miles away began firing continuous support missions into the jungle surrounding the landing zone. Forward observers with Moore's battalion directed the strikes by radio, adjusting the impact points only meters away from American positions. This was dangerous. But it was necessary. Shells slammed into the jungle canopy, exploding among advancing North Vietnamese units and forcing them to break formation before they could close with the American perimeter. Meanwhile, helicopter gunships circled overhead. The pilots flew repeated attack runs along the tree lines, firing rockets and machine guns into areas where enemy movement had been spotted. Their ability to appear suddenly above the battlefield created constant pressure on North Vietnamese units attempting to regroup. And this is where coordination became everything. Moore's command post became the nerve center of the battle. Every few seconds another radio transmission arrived, reports of enemy movement, requests for ammunition, calls for artillery fire. Moore and his officers listened carefully, mapping the shifting fight in their minds. When one sector of the perimeter came under heavy attack, artillery was redirected immediately. If a unit began running low on ammunition, helicopters brought supplies during the brief pauses between assaults. Nothing happened randomly. Every decision was deliberate. But the most important decision involved restraint. In close combat, panic spreads quickly. Units under intense pressure often attempt to retreat or reposition in ways that create gaps in the defensive line. Moore refused to allow that. His soldiers held their positions even when North Vietnamese troops approached within meters of their foxholes. The defensive line bent under pressure but never broke. And this is where the battle revealed a deeper truth about jungle warfare. Terrain does not simply favor the attacker or the defender. It favors the force that adapts fastest. The North Vietnamese had mastered movement through the jungle. Their soldiers maneuvered silently through dense vegetation, appearing suddenly at the edge of the clearing. But the Americans adapted by turning the landing zone itself into a fortress. The open ground allowed them to concentrate firepower, coordinate artillery, and maintain the helicopter lifeline that kept reinforcements flowing into the fight. The two systems collided directly at the tree line. Each North Vietnamese assault attempted to close the distance and neutralize American firepower. Each American defensive response used artillery and concentrated machine gun fire to keep the attackers just far enough away. Meters mattered. Seconds mattered. And over the course of that long afternoon, the battle turned into a brutal contest of endurance. Wave after wave of North Vietnamese soldiers pushed toward the clearing. Wave after wave was thrown back. But every repelled assault came at a cost. American casualties continued to rise. The isolated platoon in the jungle remained trapped. Ammunition stocks were being consumed faster than expected. And as the sun began to sink behind the mountains surrounding the valley, a new and even more dangerous phase of the battle was approaching. Because night in the jungle changes everything. By the time darkness settled over the Ia Drang Valley, both sides understood that this battle was unlike anything they had expected. For the Americans, the day had revealed a brutal truth. Helicopters could place soldiers anywhere on the battlefield, but once those soldiers were on the ground, the jungle erased many of the technological advantages the United States depended on. Visibility collapsed. Units became separated. Enemy forces could maneuver unseen only meters away. The battlefield shrank. Every engagement turned into close combat. But the North Vietnamese had learned something equally important. American units, once inserted, did not collapse under pressure. They adapted quickly, creating defensive strongpoints where artillery, helicopters, and disciplined infantry fire could combine with devastating effect. The fighting around Landing Zone X-ray demonstrated this with brutal clarity. North Vietnamese commanders had attempted to overwhelm the American battalion before it could fully assemble. Their plan relied on rapid movement through jungle terrain and repeated assaults designed to break the defensive perimeter. But the American response changed the equation. Instead of maneuvering aggressively across the valley, Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore's battalion held the clearing and transformed it into a coordinated defensive position. Artillery observers adjusted fire missions with extraordinary precision. Helicopter pilots flew repeated supply and evacuation missions into a landing zone that was often under direct enemy fire. The result was a battlefield where two opposing doctrines collided directly. The North Vietnamese emphasized stealth, patience, and aggressive close-range attacks. Their soldiers moved through the jungle with remarkable discipline, closing distance rapidly to neutralize American firepower. The Americans emphasized coordination and controlled firepower. Every element of their system, infantry, artillery, air support, and helicopter mobility, worked together to maintain control of the landing zone. Neither side could fully impose its strategy on the other. The North Vietnamese repeatedly closed the distance, forcing intense firefights at extremely short ranges. But every time they attempted to mass their forces for a decisive assault, artillery and aerial firepower shattered the attack before it could break the American line. And this is where the deeper strategic lesson emerged. The Ia Drang Valley revealed that the Vietnam War would not be decided by a single military advantage. Technology alone could not dominate a battlefield shaped by dense jungle and highly motivated enemy troops. But disciplined coordination of that technology could still prevent defeat, even against larger forces operating in terrain that favored them. For the North Vietnamese Army, the battle confirmed that American firepower was devastating when properly coordinated. Any assault that allowed the Americans enough distance to call artillery or air support risked catastrophic losses. For the United States Army, the battle exposed the limits of its new airmobile doctrine. Helicopters could deliver troops anywhere. But they could also place those troops into battles where the enemy already held the advantage of terrain and concealment. Future operations in Vietnam would be shaped by the lessons learned in that valley. American commanders would continue using helicopter mobility to pursue enemy forces across the country. But they would also learn to anticipate the North Vietnamese strategy of closing the distance and fighting at dangerously close range. And the North Vietnamese would refine their own approach, avoiding situations where American firepower could concentrate against large formations. The Ia Drang Valley did not end the war. But it revealed how the war would be fought. Night settled slowly over the Ia Drang Valley. The jungle that had roared with gunfire only hours earlier became eerily quiet. Smoke drifted through the clearing of Landing Zone X-ray. The smell of burnt vegetation and cordite hung in the humid air while exhausted soldiers moved carefully among shattered trees and shallow foxholes. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, in the darkness beneath the canopy, North Vietnamese units were still there. Watching. Waiting. Throughout the night, American soldiers remained in their defensive positions. Machine gunners kept their weapons trained on the black wall of jungle surrounding the clearing. Flares occasionally burst into the sky, drifting slowly downward and casting pale white light across the battlefield. Each flare revealed the same haunting scene. Broken ground. Discarded equipment. And the silent forms of men who would never leave the valley. But the battle had changed both armies in ways that would echo throughout the rest of the war. For the soldiers who fought there, the Ia Drang Valley became something unforgettable. Many of the men on the American side were experiencing their first major combat. They had entered the jungle believing that helicopters, artillery, and air support would dominate any battlefield. Instead, they found themselves fighting enemies who moved like shadows through the trees, appearing suddenly at distances so close that the fight became brutally personal. For the North Vietnamese soldiers, the battle carried its own lessons. They had proven that American forces could be fixed in place and attacked at close range. They had demonstrated that courage, discipline, and knowledge of terrain could bring them face to face with one of the most technologically advanced armies in the world. But they had also seen the devastating power of American artillery and air support when those systems were properly coordinated. Entire assaults had been shattered in seconds by explosions tearing through the jungle canopy. Neither side left the valley believing the war would be easy. In the days that followed, the fighting in the Ia Drang region continued at other landing zones deeper in the valley. Patrols moved through burned jungle. Helicopters carried the wounded and the dead away from the battlefield. When the final casualty reports were assembled, the numbers told a brutal story. Hundreds of soldiers on both sides had been killed. Thousands more would carry the memory of those few days for the rest of their lives. But numbers alone cannot explain why the Battle of Ia Drang still holds such a powerful place in military history. Because what happened in that valley was more than a single engagement. It was the first moment when the United States Army and the North Vietnamese Army truly faced each other in large-scale battle. Two different systems of warfare. Two different doctrines. Two armies testing each other in the unforgiving environment of the Vietnamese jungle. Both sides believed they had learned something from the fight. And both sides were right. Because the lessons of Ia Drang would shape every major battle that followed in the Vietnam War. Helicopters would continue to carry American soldiers deep into hostile terrain. North Vietnamese units would continue closing the distance, turning jungles and villages into battlefields measured in meters. And across Vietnam, the war would unfold exactly as the Ia Drang Valley had revealed it. Not as a short campaign decided by technology or numbers. But as a long, grinding struggle fought in the shadows of the jungle, where courage, endurance, and survival mattered just as much as strategy. And for those who stood in the clearing of Landing Zone X-ray on those November days in 1965, the sound of helicopter blades fading into the distance would always carry the memory of a battlefield where two armies discovered the true nature of the war they had just begun to fight.